welcome you guys. Hope you had a great morning thus far. Okay, we'll be discussing today an overview of quality systems, looking at quality systems from a site perspective. So if we look at using our quality systems and proactively assessing them, we can use them to help assess and control compliance with good clinical practice. So we'll talk about an overview of sponsor and clinical investigator responsibilities. We'll look at how we hope to identify the active elements of a functional quality system at the clinical research site. So the expectation, as we'll discuss, is doing this prospectively before we get into the midst of things. You guys are coming from a site perspective, so what expectations for development should you have in place? We'll look at implementation of a quality system and how it can assist in the requirements for meeting our obligations from a regulatory perspective. We'll talk about how quality system overlaps with FDA guidance documents, and we have a schematic that we like to draw on, certainly when we're looking at making sure those systems are functional at the site level. We'll also look at some recent noncompliance concerns and talk about how that quality system framework can be utilized to really address these things, as we said, prospectively, to be able to assess if things are functioning as they should, and also to deal with any corrective and preventive actions that you might need to bring into play. So when we think about responsible parties in clinical research, we know that there are several groups that are responsible for ensuring that we meet the requirements of good clinical practice. As we talk through this and that quality systems approach, our take really is going to be looking at our products, so to speak, in clinical research as being good data from protected subjects. And that's really the goal of good clinical practice. It's those scientific and ethical standards for ensuring that we have integrity of the data and the individuals from whom we have obtained that data have been protected. So when we think about GCP, it is all of those things. It's the regulations, it's the guidelines, it's the SOPs, it's the protocol. It's what we say we're going to follow. It's the state laws like you have in California. It's also that system of mutual accountability. And I don't know when this slide turned into like a Minecraft slide, but those were circles last time I checked. But looking at this in terms of a Venn diagram, we have regulatory authorities, clinical investigator, and the site, sponsors, CROs, and IRB's ethics committees. And when we look at these, we know that there's a lot of redundancy and overlap in the regulations and the guidances and the guidelines, because in that center where that overlap takes place is where we're able to meet those objectives of good data from protected subjects. There is that overlap because the expectation is if one of us fails, unfortunately, then the others can be there to kind of catch that, so we don't end up with that global system failure. You can have a really good site, a very strong site, and maybe not very good monitoring. A lot of times monitors are sent for the site to train. You could have maybe a sponsor that's not strong or engaged. You could have an IRB that is really not aware of the requirements. So we look to one another to certainly have checks and balances, but we're also going to be responsible for minding our own processes and our own responsibilities. And the FDA has put this in place when they look at warning letters. We see this too. The takeaway here is that we have a lot of overlap in what we do. And when we have seen global system failures, it's been when none of the groups were doing what they were supposed to do. They were relying on the other to do it. IRBs that were being relied upon by the sponsor and the investigator to make sure that all the elements of informed consent were in place, but the IRB wasn't even aware of what was required. So the FDA, as we were saying in those warning letters, does document that, when an investigator tells the FDA, well, my IRB let me do this, or my monitor said I could do it this way, the FDA is going to come back and say, all right, but your responsibilities are clearly defined for you when you sign that 1572, for example. So there is a warning letter recently to a Dr. Aqua where he actually pulled that out and said, well, the CRO said I could do it this way, and they didn't necessarily buy that. So we have to think about those responsibilities. This is just a high level. You guys are probably familiar with this when we think about the regulatory baseline in our hierarchy of GCP. We look at 21 CFR 11, 50, 54, 56, 312, and 812. But focusing on sponsor and investigator responsibilities, we're going to see those wrapped up primarily in 312 and 812, of course, information, 21 CFR Part 50 for informed consent, 21 CFR 56, because we're required to make sure that those IRBs are in compliance with 56107. So we really can't get away from these regulations. And we hear from folks sometimes when we're interviewing them during audits, it's not really my responsibility, or that's a CRO responsibility or a sponsor responsibility. And sometimes in the case of sponsors, we hear, well, that's really a ClinOps responsibility or a data management responsibility. And the investigator might say the same. Well, my study coordinator was supposed to handle that. But the regulations are written for sponsors and investigators. So study coordinators aren't even mentioned in the regulations. So we have to think about who really owns these processes and is responsible for them.